From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Rosie Wright. Last month, Sir Keir Starmer seemed very sure of his position. The US would not be allowed to use the UK's bases for any strikes against Iran.
Keir Starmer, according to The Times today, has apparently blocked a request from Donald Trump to allow American planes to use British air bases to attack Iran. The British Prime Minister claims that allowing such operations to take place would breach international law.
And then this week came the pivot.
Iran is pursuing a scorched earth strategy, so we are supporting the collective self-defense of our allies and our people in the region. We are not joining these strikes, but we will continue with our defensive actions in the region.
So the UK will now allow the US to use its bases to bomb Iranian missile launch sites. There are also British jets flying in the region to intercept Iranian drones, and Britain is sending a warship to Cyprus.
It is clear that Iran's outrageous response has become a threat to our people, our interests, and our allies, and it cannot be ignored.
This all comes as things are really amping up in the war.
The president said it's about to get even less safe. He said, quote, "We haven't even started hitting them hard. The big wave hasn't even happened. The big one is coming soon."
Right from the beginning, we projected 4 to 5 weeks, but we have capability to go far longer than that. We'll do it.
So as the conflict in the Middle East unfolds, is the UK getting dragged in really ever deeper? The Story today. Will the UK be drawn into war with Iran?
We've responded like the very good lawyer that Keir Starmer is. It's really very legalistic.
That's Michael Evans, defence contributor for The Times. He used to be based in Washington as our Pentagon correspondent there, and he's been writing about defence for 37 years, covering a whole variety of wars: Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan.
And actually, I tend to sympathise with the view that he has taken on the legal side. This is a war which was, they like to call it a war of choice. In other words, Iran, as far as I'm aware, wasn't about to attack the United States. So there wasn't any reason to launch a war in that sense. And I'm assuming this is what Keir Starmer concluded. There wasn't a real reason for attacking Iran at this point in time.
So can you explain, sort of at the time of recording now, what is the government's position on war in the Middle East, and how has the Prime Minister changed tack over the last few days?
The position, as far as the UK government is concerned, is that it is not involved and will not be involved in the campaign launched by America and Israel against Iran.
Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom was not involved in the initial strikes on Iran by the US and Israel. That decision was deliberate.
What has happened in the last couple of days is that after the initial attacks by Israel and America on Saturday, Iran began retaliating, launching ballistic missiles, drones against countries in the Gulf. And there are countries in the Gulf where Britain has British troops, British assets, British aircraft, and the Gulf states appealed to Britain and others to come to their aid. So the yardstick had changed. And so this gave him a new reason for changing his mind. So what he came up with is again understandable, but has landed him in trouble with Trump. So Trump clearly, or one of his officials clearly, had been in touch with Downing Street and had said, look, we're now having retaliatory strikes. Will you please let us, after all, use UK bases? And they're talking specifically about RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire and Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean to use these bases for attacks. We need these bases. Previously, Starmer had said no. On this occasion, he said yes, but only in a defensive manner. In other words, you can use these bases only for launching attacks on Iran's missile sites and launchers from where these attacks on the Gulf states have been launched. It's a very careful, thin line, because who's to know where these bombers will go from Fairford and Diego Garcia? The fog of war will start to possibly get in the way, and who knows what will happen. So it's a very careful, legalistic line based on self-defense. Self-defense is a crucial element of the UN Charter. In other words, we as a country are entitled to take action, whatever the action might be, to defend ourselves and our allies.
Yeah, the Prime Minister said that it was for specific and limited defensive purposes. I wonder what the scale of that currently is right now, because we heard that the RAF is engaged in sort of defensive actions across the region. Also, we're hearing now news of a warship heading to Cyprus. Can you kind of encompass everything that the British military is doing right now?
There have been attacks on RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, and therefore we as a country are entitled to take action to defend them. So the British government has sent the warship, and it has already got fighter aircraft in the region to act against incoming drones or missiles or whatever comes up. So in other words, a Typhoon aircraft would be scrambled to go up and shoot down a drone or shoot down a missile if that's possible. So it's all part of the same argument, if you like. We are taking action to protect our interests, our people who are based out there, and the interests we have in the region.
And one of the Prime Minister's interests is staying in a good relationship with the US president. And what we saw in the last 24 hours is Keir Starmer publicly rebuking Trump in the House of Commons.
This government does not believe in regime change from the skies.
And Donald Trump's hit back, saying, I was disappointed by how long it took for you to change your mind. The Prime Minister's under huge amounts of political pressure, and we'll get onto the domestic side in a moment or two. But to what extent is he also having to tread very carefully the fact that, yes, he wants to keep international law, but also keep his relationship sweet with one of our closest allies, the US?
I think probably Keir Starmer, of all the leaders in Europe, has had the most difficult task to play. The reason is that, historically, Britain and the United States do have, and I know it's a sort of cliche, but they do have this special relationship. It's not, incidentally, based on a love match between the White House and number 10 Downing Street, although that's an added effect of it. It stems from an extraordinary intelligence relationship with the two countries. So even when Trump says the relationship is now looking a little bit different to Mr. Starmer, it won't alter the fact that the very foundation of the special relationship will remain as solid as ever. But politically, which is what we're talking about, things are all over the place. And poor Keir Starmer had attempted to do what actually caused some ridicule, to cozy up to Trump to such an extent that it almost was embarrassing. But it seemed to work because the president appears to like flattery, and Keir Starmer was prepared to offer it. Now it all seems to have gone awry, and I think he's going to have a bit of a struggle to get back what he had before. Maybe when he next phones Trump will just put the phone down. Who knows?
I guess looking on from this, and regardless of the status of the relationship, actually how influential a player actually is the UK here? Are we just sort of mere observers rather than actually any sort of material player, one which the US would rely on?
We're not a material player at all, apart from providing these two bases, which actually is very important. Fairford is built and constructed to take American bombers. I mean, it's all set up for them. Diego Garcia, likewise, absolutely crucial. But apart from that, we're not playing a role at all.
You've spoken quite with some degree of empathy for the position that the Prime Minister finds himself in, and his political opponents, I think, will say, where you described it as the Prime Minister changing his mind on allowing the US to use these bases, they'll say that's another U-turn. To what extent is the political pressure at home helping navigate the decisions that the Prime Minister makes?
I think, he has been accused of making many U-turns. I think this is the 15th or the 16th. I mean, I don't regard it as a U-turn, to be honest. I think, although that's good political fun, this is a tactical and strategic decision. It's a decision by a government which says we are under attack, not in this country. And by the way, we're not threatened by Iran in this country. They don't have missiles with a long enough range to hit this country. But we do have a lot of interest in the Middle East. And so I think he's made this decision. Okay, it may have come from a phone call from the White House saying, can you now change your mind? And it is a change of mind. There's no question about that. However, the circumstances have changed. The situation has changed.
One thing the Prime Minister does want to do, a very publicly stated aim and reiterated at the beginning of this year, is bring down the cost of living. Analysts are already warning, our household bills could really soar because of this global conflict. We don't know what's happening yet to oil prices, the longer term repercussions. The Prime Minister has to navigate that too.
It was Harold Macmillan who once said a long time ago that it was events, dear boy, that caused the problems for him and for all prime ministers, events. And here we are. We've got the spring statements and, the Chancellor's having to do it, knowing in the background that we are now into sort of day 4 of a war, effectively, which will, as you rightly point out, will have a big impact on the price of oil. And the price of oil means that we'll all be in trouble. So I think it's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unpredictability. And for Starmer, he has now got a serious problem of having to deal with President Trump and to try and sort out their relationship and get it back to an even keel. It's always events which can get in the way of running a smooth government.
I mean, in sort of first impressions, it feels like the opening salvos of 2001 after 9/11, when the US moved very quickly to take down the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
That's General Sir Patrick Sanders, former Chief of the General Staff. In other words, head of the army. He's also the co-host of our sister podcast, The General and the Journalist. He's walking me through his initial reaction to what's been happening in the Middle East.
In terms of the air war, it feels a bit like the opening stages of the first Gulf War. But the point is that this is an air war. It's not a ground war. The first days of any conflict like this, everyone's in shock. And so to make bigger comparisons like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I don't think it is like that. I think what we're seeing here is a more limited air war. And the problem is that the lack of clarity around the objectives means it's very difficult to judge how long it's going to go on, and indeed at this stage how successful it's going to be.
I'm pleased you said that about the objectives. Do you think you can understand what it is exactly that Netanyahu and Donald Trump actually want to achieve here?
Well, we should also be clear about whether or not their objectives are the same. I mean, at the moment, I think US and Israeli interests are aligned in the sense that, there's no doubt that the Iranian regime has represented, an existential threat to Israel and certainly a very, very destabilizing threat to the region, and has threatened the United States' interests and indeed other allies' interests. So wanting to weaken the regime, to limit its ability to develop nuclear weapons, to reduce its capacity to launch ballistic missiles across the region, and to sort of limit
the activities of the proxies that have been sponsored by Iran, those are all things I think that both sides would have in common. But of course, the Americans and President Trump has spoken about going further than that and has spoken about regime change.
We continue this mission with ferocious, unyielding resolve to crush the threat this terrorist regime poses to the American people, and a threat indeed it is.
And at the moment, it feels as if that is an aspiration. It would be an outcome that they would hope for, but for the time being, it's very difficult to see how you can use the sort of military force that they've got deployed in the region at the moment ultimately to affect and change the regime, because this is a regime that, isn't fragile. If anything, it's anti-fragile. It's very resilient. Removing one leader, as we've seen, doesn't fundamentally change the regime's behavior. It's still in power, it's still in force. And so I think that's why you've seen some of the people who've been speaking on behalf of the US just walking back from the more grandiose statements that President Trump made in that 8-minute tweet that he pushed out.
Yeah, I mean, Pete Hegseth said exactly that. He said a regime change would be down to the Iranians, sort of stepping away from that a little. I wonder the sort of first set of objectives that you gave, to what extent the UK share those as well?
I think we would share all of them. I mean, the government's been very, very clear, not just this government, but previous governments have been very clear about doing everything we can to prevent Iran becoming a nuclear state. I mean, in a sense, we had that solution open to us through the Joint Combined Plan of Action, the JCPOA. We've always been opposed to Iran's behavior with its proxies and the destabilizing activities and influences had in the region, and no one wants to see them launching ballistic missiles. So I think those interests are aligned. And, I speak as someone who lost soldiers under my command and was, personally attacked and shot at by Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. We should be clear that this regime is responsible for the deaths of, 179 British soldiers during the Iraq War. And of course, regionally, far more deaths, tens of thousands of deaths over the years, and of course of its own people. So I don't think there's any love lost for this regime, and there will be no tears shed for the death of Khamenei.
Prime Minister yesterday specifically mentioned Iraq. He said, we all remember the mistakes of Iraq and we've learned those lessons. It does sort of loom really quite large, I think, when there's any debate about the UK's role in conflict, particularly in the Middle East. Why do you think the Prime Minister said that?
There's clearly deep scar tissue within the Labour Party. And I think what you're seeing from those statements is Keir Starmer speaking to his own backbenchers, speaking to, a lot of MPs and members of the Labour Party who were either opposed to the Iraq War or felt that they were dragged in on a false premise. And it's the legacy that Tony Blair carries with him. But it also, it does speak to a wider national sense of people wondering what the Iraq War was for. And I think one of the reasons those scar tissues run so deep is, we took casualties. 179 by the standards of wars is a low number, but of course each of those is an individual tragedy. But because there was a sense of us being taken in on a false premise, because we didn't then resource the war effectively, because there wasn't a conclusion, a clear outcome, a clear victory, then all of that creates this psychosis, if you like, around the Iraq War. And we went to great lengths to try to identify what the lessons were. They were captured very well, by the Iraqi inquiry, the Chilcot report. And it's worth just rattling through a few of those lessons to remind ourselves. The first is that war has to be seen as a genuine last resort, so that you shouldn't move to military action before all the peaceful options have been exhausted. And then those are the lessons around the legal basis and making sure that you get formal written advice, that there's a process where there is a clear legal condition, a legal basis for the war. And then perhaps this is the most important for me, you've got to make sure that you you align ends, ways and means, that you're clear up front what success looks like. You've got a clearly defined political objective, and that the military plan is in support of achieving that objective, and that the resources are then provided to make sure that you do it. And here I wonder if there's an element of, and it's not just President Trump, but many politicians find themselves in this position, political leaders, about not wanting to be too specific about the political objective, about wanting degree of creative uncertainty so that they can describe victory on their own terms.
I mean, what you've just said echoes quite a bit of what the Prime Minister said yesterday. Not only that he thought that Trump's airstrikes in Iran were sort of a breach of international law, but he said, and I'm quoting here, it lacked a viable, thought-through plan. But the UK are already involved in that plan, very much so, the Prime Minister's been keen to stress, in a defensive capacity. But I wonder if you think there is a risk of the UK being dragged in further than the Prime Minister was happy to state, because how fine a line is there between defensive and then offensive operations?
They're two sides of the same coin, because in war, you don't just sit back and absorb blows. You need to strike back. And so part of defense is making sure that you deal with some of the offensive capabilities that your opponent, that your enemy, your adversary has. And it's a bit like, in archery terms, there's no point in just trying to shield yourself from the arrow. Sometimes the only effective way of dealing with it is to shoot the archer. And that means conducting offensive operations to take down parts of, in this case, the Iranian regime's capabilities. Now, I don't think that's where we are at the moment. I think we are very much in a defensive counter-air space where we're dealing with incoming threats, whether they're ballistic missiles or drones, as they come at UK bases or indeed those of our allies. The risks are always around escalation. So you can see that if the Iranians, as they lash out at the countries in the region, begin to target things or inflict casualties that are really of critical value to countries in the region who we have relationships with, they could then ask us for additional assistance. And that's where there's got to be a calculus around, okay, are we providing enough purely with this defensive counter-air in order to protect our allies or our interests? Do we need to go further? And those are the sort of discussions that will be going on around thinking through the next phase.
And I think the British people probably watching on are nervous of to what extent. Really, the question is, could the UK end up at war with Iran? And I think particularly when the drone hit the base, the UK air base in Cyprus, that was on Sunday night, there was quite a lot of nervousness. How did you read what happened there, and to what extent that does sort of pull UK forces in deeper?
I don't see that risk. We have long anticipated that Iran or some of Iran's proxies would lash out and target British bases in one or more of these regional confrontations that pop up from time to time with Iran. And whether that's in Bahrain or whether it's in Cyprus, that's something that we've kind of factored in. And of course, this drone, there were no casualties, there was no significant damage, but we should anticipate more of that. I think that this is simply part of the currency of operating in the region. You've got to expect that from time to time you're going to be attacked. It doesn't automatically follow that you then have to get drawn into a full-out shooting war with Iran.
It was a drone attack, as you mentioned. Drone warfare does seem to have just changed everything. And there's lots of kind of questions about the military capability of Iran right now in comparison to America, Israel, us as well, our ability to defend against these attacks. How would you sort of put that weighing scale?
I mean, the Iranians have been at the sort of forefront of developing some of these drones. I mean, the Shaheed is one that you will have heard and read about being used extensively in Ukraine by the Russians. And they can produce vast volumes of these relatively cheap, dumb drones with relative impunity and through distributed sites throughout Iran. And in a sense, what the Iranians seem to be doing at the moment is not using up their arsenal of more sophisticated ballistic missiles, but throwing a volume of drones at different targets around the region partly as a strategy of trying to exhaust the limited air defense stockpiles that the Israelis and the United States and some of the other partners in the region will have, and then save up their ballistic missiles, then subsequently to follow through. And of course, the US are trying to target the launches, and the Israelis are trying to target the launches that go after those. So this is a reminder that drones are going to be an enduring feature of any war going into the future. You know, until we start placing orders and giving clear direction to industry, and we start improving our own capabilities, we're just falling further and further behind.
Yeah, it's sort of a frightening and fascinating discussion to look at. And at the same time, Donald Trump said last night, he's warned the US is preparing more airstrikes on Iran, saying the big one is coming soon. I think we might have thought the big one had already come over the weekend. What do you read into that in terms of what the US are preparing?
I don't know what President Trump means by the big one, but what I think is happening is that now that the US have established what you would call local air superiority over Iran, so that gives the US and the IDF the ability to operate with almost complete impunity in Israeli airspace, it means that they can step up the intensity of the attacks and go after, you know, the full range of targets that they will have planned, whether that's around, you know, the nuclear facilities, whether it's around ballistic missile production, or whether it's around regime infrastructure and getting after the command and control. So I think what they're probably speaking to is an increase in intensity.
Yeah, I mean, intensity, he's also said this could go on for 4 or 5 weeks. Netanyahu said this was definitely not going to be sort of a long, protracted war. But what's your sense, sort of reading the situation as it is, as to how this develops?
I think, what do we know? We know that on all sides, particularly for the US, the issue of stockpiles will be key. So there is a finite amount of munitions that the United States will have, and that puts an end date on this. I can't sit here and predict where this is going to end up, other than I think we can all be certain that this is a campaign that will last for weeks, not months, that there won't be a ground component to it, and that success or failure will hinge on whether or not they've been able to achieve, at the very least, the limited objectives of writing down Iran's nuclear enterprise to a point where we can be confident they can't regenerate it for some years to come.
I think the final thing is it's been very turbulent, pretty shocking what's happened, even though we anticipated some US-Israeli action of this scale was going to come. How would you define, really, the impact of the military action that started 4 days ago in terms of what it might do and change the region for decades to come?
It's too early to tell. What I think has shocked a lot of countries in the region is how rapidly the Iranians escalated and lashed out and attacked countries in the region. And that will have fundamentally changed what were relationships of accommodation between Gulf states in Iran, because they had found ways of living with Iran that managed the risks. And that dynamic has now changed. The damage that has been done to countries that may have hosted these US bases but were in no way involved with attacking Iran, and in almost all cases will have been doing everything to try to persuade President Trump that mediation was the path ahead. And then there'll be a huge degree of nervousness about what follows, because, of course, one of the other lessons from Chilcot that we didn't talk about is you have to plan for the day after. If you are inflicting damage on a country and trying to bring about a collapse or a change in the regime or its behavior, then you can unleash forces that will have much, much worse and wider regional consequences. And look at what has happened in Syria, in Libya and Iraq, the other areas where there has been intervention, and those have caused huge amounts of human suffering and damage across the region, not just in those countries. So the Gulf countries will be most worried about what happens next. particularly if the regime collapses.
That was General Sir Patrick Sanders, former Chief of the General Staff and Commander of Joint Forces Command. And before him, Michael Evans, defence contributor and former Pentagon correspondent in Washington at The Times. To hear more of Patrick, you can catch him on our sister podcast, The General and the Journalist. Today's producers were Sophie McNulty and Olivia Case. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design and theme composition was by Mal Lissetto. And I'm Rosie Wright. Do leave us a review if you can. It helps others find us. And, as ever, if you'd like to get in touch, it's thestory@thetimes.com. See you again soon.